Okay, hi everyone. My name is Guillermo Alfonso Quintero. I'm from Colombia and I'm studying here at the Universidad Nacional de Colombia. I also belong to this research group called Grupo de Estudios Sociales de la Ciencia, la Medicina y la Tecnología, which will be like social studies of science, medicine, and technology group. Today, I will be talking about some ideas I've been thinking through my master's research, and I called it "On Fish and Monkeys: Some Thoughts About Time and the Colonial History of Linguistics." And so, these are the 4 moments I will be dividing this talk into. And the very first moment is like talking about this navigation chart, which is the story that appears in the book A Rainha Ginga e de Como os Africanos Inventaram o Mundo, which is a novel by the Angolan writer José Eduardo Aguarusa. So I will be reading this story, and I hope you to pay attention to these orange slides when they show up, because that will be the sign of a division. As I told you, this talk will be divided into 4 different moments, and you'll know the introduction of a new moment when this orange slide appears. So let's start with the first one. I went to visit Ongolo not to deliver a message from the governor, but because I had the desire and curiosity to see him again. I found him while he was preparing the mufete. He didn't seem surprised by my visit. I sat down on a mat while the magician roasted the cacusos. We shared the pirón de mandioca, which the Ambundus usually call fungi. The Portuguese brought cassava to Africa, and today it is the staple food of almost all natives. However, they don't prepare it like the Indians. They invented new ways and have taken ownership of the plant in such a way that it seemed like it had always been there. Ongolo was delighted to hear me speak Kimbundu and was glad about my visit. "The priests don't like me. Why did you come?" he said. "I am no longer a priest. The church expelled me." "Don't be too hard on yourself for that. White people have done good things, but the church is not one of them. Why do the priests insist on bothering us with their God and their devil? They believe it's their duty to save Africans." So we start this encounter with Ongolo and his talks about church, about God and the devil, and this white duty to save the Africans. And now we're moving to a different place of the world, but a place that could perfectly fit into Ongolo's description. As I live and research here, I will be talking about Colombia and Colombia's history. For those of you that don't know this side of the world, Colombia is located right in the northwestern part of South America. And our country is very famous internationally as the place that has more than 50,000 species of animals and plants. Along with this information, our country has also been described as one of the most linguistically diverse in South America, besides Brazil and besides Mexico in North America. It is known that there are at least 687 indigenous peoples in our country, and they speak 65 different languages. Of course, they are not the only languages spoken in this territory, but as I will be focusing only on indigenous languages, I will speak about the others. So in this map, on the right side of your screen, you can see the map of the linguistic diversity of Colombia. As you can see, languages are located as colored dots along the territory, and this territory has national borders, and those different colors represent different linguistic families. But what does this map mean, and what is it representing beyond the numbers and the very idea of linguistic diversity of some place? So my ongoing research critically examines how these objects are produced within linguistics as a science, and also how linguistics has been produced as a science. To do so, I am writing a history of how the descriptive linguistics that works with indigenous languages became a discipline here in Colombia. And what this means is that I'm putting linguistics in the center as the object of my research. To do so, I am using the theoretical and methodological frame of science and technology studies. And I am looking into the archive of a very interesting moment of the history of my country. So if you read any history of linguistics, of indigenous languages here in Colombia and how it became a discipline, you will probably hear a hero's journey in which a group of linguists and anthropologists working in France came to Colombia with the idea to establish a graduate program to research indigenous languages in our country. This happened in 1984, and that was the starting point to establish a disciplinary practice in two universities. The Universidad Nacional de Colombia, which is the main public university in our country, and the University of the Andes, which is the biggest private university. And that's it. That's the story. Just some white people feeling the duty to research these languages. But it happened that there were linguists here before of that episode of history. Okay, maybe linguists and missionaries, or maybe missionaries that worked as linguists, or maybe missionaries that used linguistics as a tool, or were they linguists using missions as a tool? Anyway, before that episode of creating graduate programs in the universities, the Summer Institute of Linguistics was working in Colombia since 1962. Thanks to a contract that was signed between the government of Colombia and William Cameron Townsend, the founder of Summer Institute of Linguistics. And this contract was to conduct, and I quote, exhaustive research and study of all the indigenous languages existing in the Colombian territory. This contract with the seal remained in effect until 2000, but what happened in between? As you can see here in your screen, we have again the same map of Colombia with several numbers indicating the places and languages that Summer Institute of Linguistics was working on in 1975, which is the year I will be talking about. So, in 1975, the biggest part of the Colombian territory was managed by different Catholic missions because the Colombian government had signed a concordat with the Vatican, considering the Catholic region as a fundamental part of the common goods and as a part of the integral development of the national community. So this concordat established some functions for the Catholic missions, especially in territories where indigenous peoples were living at the time. So in this map, most of the Amazon region, here at the south, most of the Pacific coast, and most of the Llanos Orientales, which is this blue area in the border with Venezuela, were the territories that were under the government of the Catholic missions as a way for the state to manage those territories and the people living in those places. And it happened that in these regions, actually, those regions were the home of most of the indigenous peoples living in our country. So the first years of the 70s were also interesting because the Colombian government, as other countries here in Latin America, were deciding what indigenous peoples meant to their nations and what should they do about them. And when I say what should they do about them, I mean how were they going to participate into the economic systems of each country and how were they going to contribute to each country's development. So this was a problem, and they called it the problem of the Indian, or el problema indígena. And several countries managed to promote this politic here, Indigenism, or Indigenism, I don't know if that word exists, which was a political and government agenda that established the directed acculturation of indigenous peoples in order to modernize Latin American states by incorporating them like into their nations and allowing them to overcome their primitive conditions and to participate in the progress of their nations. But which is the role of linguistics in this scenario? So our second part, forest and lagoon. The sun was shining on the silver lagoon. We stood in silence for a while, sharing the perfection of the afternoon, and at the end, Ongolo said, "Do you know the story of the monkey and the fish?" I did not. Then the Kimbanda began to tell me. A monkey was walking through the forest. He was jumping among the trees. And when he came up on a lagoon like this one, and looking at it, delighted and surprised at the same time, for all the monkeys are afraid of water, he saw a fish moving in a thick mud close to the shore. What a pity, thought the monkey. That little animal with neither arms nor legs fell into the water and it's almost about to drown. So, on October 12th, 1975, the president of Colombia, Alfonso Viasus, which is this guy, I don't know, going into a plane, the first photography, traveled with his ministers to the Amazon region here in Colombia. As you are not in touch with this date, it used to be a day that commemorated the arrival of the Spaniards to the Americas in the 15th century. And nowadays it is also the National Day of Spain, which apparently commemorates Spanish legacy worldwide. So kind of commemoration of colonialism. But anyway, on October 12th, 1975, for the very first time, a president of Colombia travels to the Amazon and he's promoting a celebration called Day of the Colombianity, if I can say so, which is here in Spanish, Día de la Colombianidad, as a date to commemorate not only the arrival of the Spaniards to the Americas, but also to commemorate the miscegenation, or maybe the mestizaje, the mixing of Spain inheritance and the indigenous inheritance of the Colombian citizens. So this president was also promoting the idea of bridging the gap between two Colombias, the one that lived in the center of the country and in the main cities, and the other one that lived in rural areas, which in some parts of the country were mainly indigenous populations. It was said in the main newspapers of that time that around 3,600 indigenous people joined the president that day. And those are the other photographs you can see there, like people traveling to meet the president. So this president gave a speech called National Integration, Integración Nacional. And he was talking about the importance of defining national borders, to the need to strengthen the Colombian institutions, and the need to guarantee the flow of resources to the rural Colombia in order to maintain social investment. He also decided to speak about Colombian identity and said that the indigenous peoples of the country were, as you can see there, first, the raw material of national identity, second, a national value to be preserved, and third, the components of the true Colombian race. He also spoke with pride about the indigenous blood as they were the true owners of this territory because they had inhabited it for 15 centuries. And the president spoke with enthusiasm of the mestizaje, the miscegenation, and the cultural heritage of the indigenous true ancestors. Since over time, people from other parts of our country had mixed and ended up melting that Colombian race whose Spanish raw material was always the same. But he said that this native indigenous raw material was different. So he was very proud of this identity, and he was proud for bearing the stamp of our original indigenous blood. So it wasn't as easy to define in this time what was Colombian citizenship and what was Colombian identity. And I don't know, is this a country of indigenous and non-indigenous peoples? Who was in charge to define who of them were indigenous and who of them were non-indigenous? This president that you can see here wearing some feathers and some, I don't know, some indigenous gifts to them. He had a problem, and yeah, you know, he was proud of the true Colombian race, but he didn't know if that true Colombian race was a Spanish-speaking one, and he didn't know if that identity spoke indigenous languages, or maybe if one of those languages had enough power to promote the idea of the miscegenated identity. So the problem was named by the president as the Colombian linguistic problem, and of course it was related to the Indian problem that I talked before. And he said in an interview that Colombia needed the work of different universities and national institutes to promote a national research agenda that focus on indigenous languages, and that they had the mission to do all the work that Summer Institute of Linguistics was already doing in our country. By doing so, the Colombian state would have the perfect opportunity to end the contract with the Summer Institute of Linguistics. So this is the moment, October 12, 1975, is the moment in which indigenous languages became an object of interest to the Colombian government in two different ways. The first one as the support of this traditional or indigenous inheritance of our nation and our nation miscegenated identity. And the second one as an object that needed to be researched, because the only way to solve this Colombian linguistic problem was promoting Spanish within indigenous communities for them to enter the education system of the country and to be useful citizens of the state, economically speaking. And now, were the linguists ready to do such research? And were they ready to start this national agenda on researching indigenous languages? So we're moving to monkeys and fish. The monkey, who was a good monkey, was greatly distressed. He wanted to jump in and save the little animal, but terror prevented him from doing so. Finally, he took courage, dived in, grabbed the fish, and threw it towards the shore. So the Minister of Government of that time sent a letter to the oldest linguistic institute of our country, which is the Instituto Caro y Cuervo, or Caro and Cuervo Institute, which was a national institute in charge of the research of Spanish in Colombia. The minister was asking for this institute to do the research on the indigenous languages. And then the linguist leading this institute, Jose Manuel Rivas Sacconi, replied. He was supportive of the idea of an institute with a national agenda to research indigenous languages. And here's a quote of what he said. There is every justification for a Colombian institute to take on the task of cultivating linguistics for scientific purposes and in a systematic way. He also suggested that some ideas about what linguists do the Colombian government needed. So he said, in order to train researchers of indigenous languages, it would be necessary to count on the collaboration of one or more European experts of the highest level and of recognized scientific authority. But he didn't think his institute could be that institute. So he said, the Carmen Cuervo Institute has not carried out studies on indigenous languages because it has concentrated its efforts on the cultivation, conservation, and teaching of Spanish. I have written Castellano in brackets because it's another form to refer to this language, but specifying the inheritance from a specific part of Spain. And then in another letter, this linguist, Jose Manuel Rivas Sacconi, wrote the following: I don't think here in Colombia there is an Indian problem, nor the need to establish any indigenous policy. There is no need to define what is already defined. The policy towards indigenous population was provided by the nationality itself in the royal decrees. He's referring to like the Spaniard conquest and the colonial times of in relation with Spain. So in the royal decrees, which in a humanitarian, Christian and Colombian way try this matter, like the indigenous matter. Thanks to several missionary priests of the colonies, such as Ludo, Dadei, Gumila, and some others, and contemporary missionaries as Celedón, Castelví, Casas Manrique. And thanks to the civilization they represent and the nationality they manifested through their will and ways of being and act, Colombia is nowadays the most integrated country of the Hispano-American continent, a miscegenated country with defined features. And in such circumstances, he said, promoting the concept of Indigenism or is promoting an anti-historical, artificial, and inconvenient idea. So in this letter, Jose Manuel Rivas Sacconi, as a linguist, also expressed what he felt about the interest of the government in indigenous languages and peoples. And he expressed what he thought was the best way to govern them. And so here is another quote of his letters. Indigenism, misunderstood, has an anti-Hispanic flavor. The goal of a real national policy related to indigenous peoples should be their integration to the Colombian community, making them fully sharers of the goods of education, health, housing, and providing them with access to contemporary civilization through the use of a common language, Spanish, and facilitating their access to the right time, the international time, without them forgetting the use of their languages. So right here, as you can see, right here, as you can see, linguistics is not only about writing grammars, describing languages, or producing phonologies. In this history, linguistics is participating in the coordination of several actors that had the power to decide what was the place of indigenous languages within the nation and the power to promote or not specific policies for these languages to be studied and specific policies for these peoples. Also, this letter from Rivas Sacconi shows us a modern idea of time and how he uses this time to organize populations. Following his arguments, indigenous peoples need access to civilization through Spanish language, as if they were living in an outside and distant zone of that civilization. They also needed access to international time, but without forgetting their languages. Also, Are indigenous peoples the one in the need of access, or is it the government and governmental institution needing something from them? So what connect Rivas Aconi and the president, this linguist and the president, is this idea of a linear time in which indigenous peoples are located in the past as ancestors of the Colombian citizens, or as people that are living in a distant past time far from civilization. And in this case, civilization would be in the more distant side of an axis of a linear time. I think I have this image. So in this axis, indigenous will be like in the past, and civilization will be the moment, the present moment, or the future moment that they need to arrive into. So no matter that these populations inhabit at the same time and space as the linguist and the president, and that this president also flew to the Amazon to meet them in person. So time here is also useful to produce ideas about race, about blood, about Hispanic blood, about miscegenation and purity, because it is said that indigenous people should not forget their languages when accessing to the Colombian civilization or the universal time. They must maintain their languages. Going back to this. And here you have a graphic example of how these ideas are translated into day-to-day discourses and images. We're looking at an editorial cartoon published in a national newspaper called El Tiempo, The Times. The title of this cartoon is The Discovering in Me Too, like relating once again to the Spanish conqueror of these territories. And on the left, you can see the Colombian president I've been talking about, Alfonso López Michelsen, and he's represented as an archetypical image of a Spanish or Spaniard colonizer with a dog, an armor, and a flag. And he's facing an indistinct group of people that are supposed to be indigenous people from Colombian Amazon in 1975. These apparent indigenous have some recognizable phenotypical features and clothes that are locating them and the president outside the time in which this cartoon is being drawn. This is also the best example of this idea of a linear time in which one side of the image represents civilization, and the other one, as they call them in that time, some primitive people. This image presents also an overlapping time. The present Colombia, embodied in the president, is encountering that primitive past embodied in those indigenous peoples. So past and present are facing each other, and one of them is looking for the best strategy to bring the other into the correct time, the civilized or international time, but saving their languages while doing it. Let's look at another example of this time and space distance being manifested. Ron Metzger, a linguist and missionary from the Summer Institute of Linguistics, was living in the Amazon in 1970. And he was researching on a Tucanoan language here in the Amazon. In that place, he was interviewed by the anthropologist Brian Moser and left us this explanation of what he thought about linguistics and how he affirmed the difference as a distance. So he said, these people, the indigenous people, are in another world. They may be on the moon. They are in another world culturally, in another world linguistically. And I think our goals in this group are to reach over that linguistic barrier, such as the spatial barrier between here and the moon. And I think it's our desire to go to the moon, to enter into their world. Of course, you could say, hey, that's a silly linguist, and I am different. And of course, I could ask, Are you different from this linguist from Chile? How? So in this history of linguistics, in this history of linguistics is the science that the Colombian government is promoting as a bridge to encounter these two different times, the indigenous past and the civilized present. Like between these two dots will be linguistics trying to bridge the gap between those times. So it is linguistics, the tool that will be used not only to study indigenous languages, but also the tool to preserve what the idea of a nation needs from the indigenous peoples, their ancestry, their cultural diversity, and their pure blood that Colombian citizens have inherited and identifies their mestizaje, their miscegenation. Linguistics will also be the tool to describe an account, but also to preserve and maintain indigenous languages in their most natural state. And this natural state refers to the idea of those languages being the ancestry or the purest past of the Colombian citizens and Colombia's history. By doing so, linguistics will establish what are the linguistic objects of the nation, and will conclude that in this region there are at least 65 indigenous languages. And this number establishes the idea of linguistic diversity in the very same way as the number of birds, plants, or animals will define Colombia as the most biodiverse nation, as I told you beginning this talk. And in this moment, the Summer Institute of Linguistics had this contract to study every language along Colombia, and the agenda of linguistics that will be established in 1984 within universities as an opposition to the activities of the Summer Institute of Linguistics will not abandon this idea of describing all the existing languages in our national territory. In its way to encounter past and present, linguistics will also be ready to define when the indigenous languages are going to stop being spoken, what are the dangers surrounding them and their speakers, and will define also the danger of this terrible rhetoric we'll be using recently, which is the rhetoric of the extinction of languages. A problem that is at the same time national, a linguistic problem, and it is a problem that it continues to be related with our present. So in the beginning of this talk, I showed you a rhetoric in which we, as linguists, interpret the others at a spatial and temporal distance. The spatial, because we don't need to know the exact places and territories in which these languages are spoken. They are in Colombia, and we have this optical ability to watch them all as a group from the space or as a group by reading texts about them. And it is temporarily distant because no matter how old this map is, we have the power to translate time into dots to represent linguistic diversity. And we can always show this map to prove that Colombia has a big number of languages and linguistic families within its national boundaries, no matter in which moment of time these data were produced or drawn. For example, renamed linguists working in Australia didn't have the need to travel along the Amazon region of Colombia, Peru, Brazil, Venezuela, and Ecuador, but she had the ability and the power to publish some books on Amazonian languages. Because as linguists, we have the power to accumulate time and space and translate them into linguistic data. And we grow our ability to be disconnected in space and time to these peoples and to these places. Also, since we are not directly related to those languages and those peoples, we must translate our motives and our ideas in the name of a bigger interest. The interest to get to know the human language ability. For example, this quote of an article by Lil Campbell, which states that since a considerable number of South American languages are endangered, this investigation, the investigation of their typological features, is urgent, for without it, we stand to lose irretrievably invaluable information for understanding the full range of typological resources in human languages. So, as I don't have the power to say, okay, I need this language to represent an object of interest for everybody around the world, I can say that this tiny language located in this specific spot is important for the history of humanity or for the history of human languages. So the purpose of showing you these examples is to actually share how current and how actual these ideas and discourses are right now, and they keep generating cultural hierarchies and accentuating a division between nature and culture, not only in my country 60 years ago, but also in different territories nowadays. So we arrived to the very last part. Do fish need monkeys? When he came up on dry land, he stood there happy watching the leaping fish. I have done a good deed, thought the monkey. Look how happy it is. I laughed. We both laughed. What I feared the most, added Ongolo when he stopped laughing, is that the fish themselves will start to believe in monkeys. So I hope this short trip to Colombian linguistic history archives showed you how it is possible to read, research, and embrace the colonial side of our discipline, and how it is not just discourses or ideas that circulate in some places or around the world. It has this colonial background has several material effects that can be traced, that can be identified. And in this case, my case, through the archives, we can also check what happened in those specific moments of constitution of linguistics as a science. Also, this colonial side of our discipline has effects in politics, in laws, and in politics now, in policies, in laws, and in all of these strategies that have been used and mobilized by nation states and their institutions to govern indigenous populations through their languages. So there's an island here in Colombia, located in the northern coast, named Isla Fuerte. This could be Strong Island in English. And in that island lives a tree that people have called the tree that walks, or the walking tree, el árbol que camina. You can see that tree in this photo. And an awesome characteristic of this tree is that it has a central trunk, but the branches, when growing, they start to grow towards the earth. So each branch will become a new root for the tree and a new trunk for other branches that on their time will become new roots and trunks and branches. So my invitation today is to think of our history as this walking tree, and as the possibility to know what these branches are made of and what can we do to become new roots for new branches. So describing and analyzing our discipline using the lenses of different theories and methodologies outside linguistics, in my case, social studies of science, would be attempts to reflect about the rhetoric, representations, and practices of our discipline. It is important to look at ourselves as we have historically looked at others, also as branches of this trunk called linguistics, and knowing that these colonial relationships still occur, still assemble, still produce data, and are materializing linguists on the one hand and indigenous languages on the other through their dialectical relationship, I can ask what kind of material practices are we defining what kind of relationships, and how are we promoting discourses that in turn also have material effects. And so looking to history is my beat to think on what exists in my present time and has always been given to me as natural, as given, as an objective idea or finished. So it is my political bet to imagine other ways of doing what I felt passionate about doing, and to accept my interest and my concerns, radically locating myself in the network of relationship in which languages are embedded and understood, and understanding that thought and knowledge are essentially relational processes that require care. So I'm based here in Maria Puig de la Bella Casa, which is this Spanish sociologist. And well, my invitation to be a walking tree is also an invitation to think with care, to build new ways of relating to what matters to me or to us as linguists, by allowing us to be affected instead of observing everything from a distance. So this research exercise I am doing, moreover, seeks to locate myself in the discourses, rhetorics, reflections, and practices that historically have constituted me as the kind of subject I am, and also as the kind of subject that participates of this science that we call linguistics. So now it's your turn to answer the question. Do you think fish need monkeys? And that's it. Thank you.